In the Imperium of Man there are no therapists. The morning shift at the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau begins at 0400 hours Terran Standard. The halls of Sublevel 97 are lit by flickering luminators that cast everything in the color of old parchment. The air tastes of recycled breath and the bitter tang of fear sweat that has soaked into the walls over decades. Here, in the depths of the Administratum complex on Mordian Prime, men and women process the death of worlds with the same methodical precision that their colleagues 3 floors above use to catalog grain shipments. Scribe Adept Matthias Vaughn has worked this shift for 11 years. His workspace is a metal desk scarred by countless stylus marks, positioned beneath a single overhead luminator that flickers every 43 seconds. On his left sits a data slate containing the morning's queue of planetary assessments. On his right, a brass stamp bearing the Aquila and the words Exterminatus authorized in Gothic script. Between them lies a cup of recaf gone cold hours ago, its surface reflecting the pale light like a dark mirror. The first request of the day comes from the Cadian sector. Planet designation Helix 7, population 4 billion souls. The reporting officer, a Colonel Vex of the 12th Cadian Shock Troops, describes an outbreak of what the field reports classify as Nurgle's rot spreading through the primary hive cities. The contamination has reached 17% of the planetary population. Protocol dictates that anything above 15% contamination requires immediate sterilization. Vaughn reads the report 3 times. The numbers swim before his eyes like insects. 4 billion souls. He tries not to think about what 4 billion people looks like. Instead, he focuses on the protocol. 17% exceeds the threshold. The math is simple. He reaches for the stamp. The brass feels cold against his palm, even through the thin fabric of his work gloves. The stamp comes down with a soft thud that echoes strangely in the quiet chamber. Another world dies, and it is not yet 0500 hours. The second request comes from the Segmentum Obscurus. Planet designation Blackstone 9, population 700 million. The reporting officer describes an artifact of unknown origin discovered in the planetary core. The local tech priests have classified it as possibly of Xenos origin and emanating psychic resonance beyond acceptable parameters. The recommendation is immediate planetary sterilization to prevent potential contamination spread. 700 million souls reduced to a line item in a morning's work. Vaughn's hand hovers over the stamp. The luminator above flickers, casting his shadow across the desk like a sundial marking time toward damnation. He brings the stamp down again. The sound seems louder this time. By midday, Vaughn has authorized the deaths of 16 worlds. The numbers blur together in his mind. 3 billion here, 800 million there, a small agri-world with only 50,000 souls that seems almost quaint by comparison. Each stamp carries the weight of unfathomable loss, yet the procedure remains the same. Read the report, verify the threat level, apply the stamp, file the authorization, move to the next world in the queue. The chamber around him holds 47 other scribe adepts performing identical tasks. The sound of stamps hitting paper creates a rhythm like distant thunder, punctuated by the scratch of styluses and the soft hum of data slates processing new requests. No one speaks unless protocol demands it. The work continues in the kind of silence that breeds in places where words have lost all meaning. During the regulation 15-minute meal period, Vaughn sits alone in the subsection mess hall. The nutritional paste on his tray has been colored to resemble actual food, though the artificial flavoring cannot mask the underlying taste of synthetic proteins and vitamin additives. Around him, his colleagues eat in the same mechanical silence they bring to their work. Occasionally, someone coughs. Once, someone laughs, but the sound dies quickly, as if strangled by the weight of the place. Vaughn stares at his reflection in the surface of his recaf. The man looking back at him has hollow cheeks and eyes that seem to belong to someone much older. He cannot remember when he last slept properly. His dreams have become populated by numbers, population counts scrolling endlessly across his vision like a data slate that never powers down. Sometimes he dreams of worlds burning, but more often he dreams of spreadsheets and authorization forms, of an infinite queue of death requests stretching beyond the horizon of his imagination. The afternoon brings new horrors wrapped in bureaucratic language. A mining world corrupted by chaos cultists. A forge world where the machine spirits have begun chanting hymns in an unknown tongue. An agri world where the crops have started growing in patterns that hurt the mind to perceive. Each world a universe of lives, hopes, dreams, and loves. Each world reduced to a stamp and a filing code. The weight of it accumulates like sediment. Vaughn finds himself checking and rechecking the reports, reading the same casualty figures until the numbers lose coherence. 4 billion, 700 million, 3 billion, 100,000. The digits begin to separate from their meaning, becoming abstract symbols divorced from the reality of flesh and blood and screaming. His hands shake when he reaches for the 23rd authorization of the day. The data slate displays the image of a world called Esperanza, a designation that translates from ancient Terran as hope. The irony is not lost on him, though he wishes it were. Hope is a world of 12 billion souls, and according to the field report, it has fallen to a gene stealer infestation that has compromised 60% of the population. 12 billion souls. Vaughn sets down the stamp and stares at the number. 12 billion individual human beings, each with a name, a family, a set of dreams and fears as complex as his own. 12 billion people who woke up this morning not knowing that their lives would end before the sun set. 12 billion people who will die because Matthias Vaughn, scribe adept of the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, picks up a piece of brass and presses it to a piece of paper. The luminator flickers 43 times while he sits motionless. Around him, the soft thunder of stamps continues its relentless rhythm. His colleagues process their own cues of damnation with the same methodical precision that has carried them through 10,000 similar days. The work must continue, the Imperium must be protected. The greater good demands sacrifice. But something has shifted in Vaughn's perception, like a lens sliding out of focus. The reports on his desk seem to shimmer and writhe, the numbers rearranging themselves into faces. He blinks hard, but the sensation persists. 4 billion becomes 4 billion pairs of eyes, all looking at him with the same question, why? He reaches for the stamp with trembling fingers. The brass feels burning hot against his palm, though he knows this must be his imagination. The administratum maintains strict environmental controls, and the temperature has not varied more than 2 degrees in the 11 years he has worked this shift. Yet the metal seems to sear his flesh, and when he looks down at his hand, he expects to see the aquila burned into his palm like a brand. The stamp comes down on the authorization for Esperanza, but the sound it makes is wrong. Instead of the familiar thud of brass on paper, Vaughn hears something that might be a scream, if screams could be made of silence and mathematics. The sound echoes in his skull long after the physical noise has faded, reverberating through the chambers of his mind like a cry for mercy that will never be answered. The rest of the day passes in a haze of mounting dread. Each authorization feels heavier than the last, each stamp leaving him more hollow. By the time the evening shift arrives to take over the work, Vaughn's hands are shaking so violently that he can barely hold his stylus. The final report of the day requires authorization for the destruction of a shrine world that has fallen to Daemon incursion. Population: 8 billion faithful servants of the Emperor. 8 billion people who dedicated their lives to worship and prayer. 8 billion souls who believed that their faith would protect them. 8 billion voices that will be silenced because the alternative is worse than extinction. The mathematics of mercy reduced to this. Sometimes, death is the greatest kindness the Imperium can offer. Vaughn brings the stamp down one final time, and this time he definitely hears the scream. It echoes through his bones, a sound like tearing metal and breaking glass, and the last breath of a dying world. He looks around wildly, expecting to see his colleagues reacting to the noise, but they continue their work with the same mechanical precision, oblivious to the cry that seems to shake the very foundations of the chamber. That night, Vaughn returns to his HAB unit in the residential sector of the complex. The space is regulation standard, 12 square meters divided into sleeping alcove, waste reclamation unit, and a combination work surface and eating area. A single window looks out onto an airshaft that extends up through 47 levels to a tiny square of sky so distant it might as well be a myth. The walls are painted in the standard administrative cream color that is supposed to promote calm and efficiency, but instead reminds him of dried bone. He sits on the edge of his sleeping cot and stares at his hands. The skin appears normal, unmarked by any physical trace of the day's work, yet he can still feel the burning sensation where the stamp touched his palm. When he closes his eyes, he sees the authorization forms spreading out before him like a vast plain of paper, each one stamped with the aquila of extinction. The forms stretch to every horizon, an infinite bureaucracy of death that will never be completed because there will always be more worlds to kill. Sleep, when it finally comes, brings no relief. Vaughn dreams of standing in a vast chamber filled with the voices of the dead. They whisper his name in languages he does not recognize, speaking of children never born and songs never sung and loves that died with the worlds he helped destroy. The voices layer upon each other until they become a roar like the sound of burning atmospheres, a hymn of accusation that follows him through the twisting corridors of his subconscious. He wakes at 0300 hours, 30 minutes before his scheduled rise time. The HAB unit is exactly as he left it, yet something feels different, as if the space has been subtly rearranged by invisible hands. The shadows seem deeper, and the narrow beam of light from the airshaft appears to bend at strange angles. When he looks directly at any particular object, it appears normal, but in his peripheral vision, everything seems to writhe with barely contained motion. The walk to sub-level 97 takes longer than usual, though the route has not changed. The corridors of the administratum complex stretch and contract like the interior of some vast organism, and more than once Vaughn finds himself taking a turn he does not remember making, only to arrive at his destination by a path that should not exist. The other early shift workers move past him like ghosts, their faces pale and indistinct in the flickering light of the luminators. His desk awaits him, exactly as he left it the night before, yet somehow different. The data slate displays the morning's queue of requests, but the numbers swim and writhe before his eyes like living things. The population figures rearrange themselves into patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Geometries of death that follow rules of mathematics he does not understand, but recognizes nonetheless as fundamentally wrong. The first authorization of the day should be routine. Planet designation Mercy 12, population 2 million, fallen to orc invasion with 0% chance of successful defense. The numbers are clear, the threat assessment unambiguous, the protocol straightforward. Yet when Vaughn reaches for the stamp, his hand passes through it as if it were made of smoke. He blinks hard and reaches again, this time his fingers close around the familiar brass shape, but when he lifts it, he sees that the aquila has been replaced by something else, a symbol that seems to shift and change whenever he tries to focus on it directly. One moment it appears to be a skull, the next a screaming mouth, then something that might be a star collapsing in on itself. The symbol burns his retinas like staring into a bright light, yet he cannot look away. The stamp comes down on the authorization form, but instead of the familiar thud, it makes the sound of a world dying. Not the quick, clean death of orbital bombardment, but the slow agony of a planet burning from the inside out. Vaughn hears the screams of 2 million souls as they realize that no one is coming to save them, that their prayers have been answered with fire and silence. Around him, his colleagues continue their work with the same mechanical precision, but now Vaughn can see the truth behind their calm facades. Each of them carries the weight of countless dead worlds in their eyes, a burden that grows heavier with every passing day. They have learned to function despite the crushing weight of complicity, but the cost shows in the way their hands shake when they think no one is watching, in the hollow spaces behind their eyes where hope used to live. The morning progresses through familiar horrors made strange by his shifting perception. Each authorization requires greater effort, as if the weight of accumulated death is building to some critical threshold. By the time the midday break arrives, Vaughn can barely lift the stamp, and when he does, it feels like holding a piece of molten metal that burns through flesh and bone to touch the soul beneath. In the mess hall, the other scribe adepts avoid looking at him directly. Their conversations die when he approaches, and they find excuses to sit at other tables. He wonders if his condition is visible somehow, if the madness gathering behind his eyes shows on his face like a mark of chaos. Perhaps they can smell the corruption on him, the sweet scent of a mind breaking down under pressure it was never designed to bear. The nutritional paste on his tray has changed color. Where it should be the regulation brown of processed proteins, it now appears red as fresh blood. When he lifts a spoonful to his mouth, it tastes of copper and salt, and he can feel it coating his throat like liquid accusation. He forces himself to eat because protocol requires it, because maintaining his physical health is essential to maintaining his efficiency, because the work must continue regardless of personal discomfort. But the work has become something else entirely. Each afternoon authorization carries voices now, the whispered pleas of the condemned, the final prayers of the faithful, the defiant curses of the rebellious. The stamp in his hand has grown heavier, as if it were forged from the compressed gravity of dead stars. When he brings it down on each form, he feels the weight of worlds pressing against his palm, the accumulated mass of 12 billion souls pushing back against the inevitability of their destruction. The reports themselves have begun to change. Where once they contained dry assessments of threat levels and contamination percentages, they now include details that should not exist in official documentation. Descriptions of children separated from parents in the evacuation riots that always fail. Accounts of lovers promising to meet again in the Emperor's light, not knowing that no light will follow the darkness coming to claim their world. Stories of old men and women who have lived their entire lives in service to the Imperium, dying with prayers to the golden throne on their lips and confusion in their hearts. These details appear between the lines of official text, visible only when Vaughn looks at the reports with his peripheral vision. When he tries to focus on them directly, they fade like dreams upon waking, leaving only the standard threat assessments and population counts. But he knows they are there, hidden in the spaces between words, speaking of the human cost that bureaucracy works so hard to abstract into manageable numbers. By the end of his third day of mounting madness, Vaughn can no longer distinguish between the voices of the living and the voices of the dead. His colleagues speak in the same whispered tones as the condemned worlds, and their words carry the same weight of final desperation. The luminator above his desk no longer flickers at regular intervals, but pulses in rhythm with his heartbeat, casting shadows that move independently of any light source. The final authorization of the day requires the destruction of a world called New Eden, population 15 billion. The name strikes him as particularly cruel. Eden, the mythical paradise from ancient Terran legends, now requiring purification by fire because paradise is an illusion the galaxy cannot afford. The threat assessment describes a plague of unknown origin that causes its victims to experience visions of peace and contentment before their bodies dissolve into component molecules. The contamination has reached 93% of the population. 15 billion people dying in blissful ignorance, their final moments filled with artificial joy as their bodies betray them at the cellular level. The plague offers them paradise as it kills them, a mercy more terrible than simple death because it robs them of the dignity of suffering. They die happy, and this makes their death somehow worse than all the others, as if joy itself has become another weapon in the arsenal of extinction. Vaughn lifts the stamp with hands that no longer feel like his own. The brass has become something else, not metal but crystallized pain, not solid but somehow liquid, flowing around his fingers like mercury made of sorrow. When he brings it down on the authorization form, the sound it makes is the sound of 15 billion people realizing, in their final instant, that their happiness was a lie. The scream that follows is his own. The sound echoes through the chamber, bouncing off the walls and ceiling until it seems to come from everywhere at once. His colleagues look up from their work with expressions of mild annoyance, as if he has committed a minor breach of protocol rather than voiced the accumulated anguish of 1,000 dead worlds. One of them, a woman whose name he has never learned, approaches his desk with a data slate in her hand. "Scribe Adept Vaughn," she says in the flat tones that pass for concern in the administratum, "you appear to be experiencing a stress response. Please report to the Mental Hygiene Division for evaluation and treatment." Mental Hygiene Division. The words hit him like a physical blow. He has heard whispers of the place, rumors shared in the kind of low voices reserved for discussion of forbidden subjects, a facility somewhere in the deep levels of the complex, where personnel who can no longer perform their duties are taken for reconditioning. No one who enters the Mental Hygiene Division ever returns to their previous position. Some say they are reassigned to less stressful duties. Others whisper darker possibilities. The woman waits patiently while Vaughn stares at her, his mind struggling to process the implications of her words. Around him, the other scribe adepts have returned to their work, the sound of stamps creating the familiar rhythm of institutional death. The queue of authorizations continues to grow, each new request carrying its burden of souls waiting for judgment. The work must continue, with or without Matthias Vaughn. He stands slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The data slate containing his morning's authorizations seems to mock him from its position on the scarred metal desk. 43 worlds destroyed before the midday break, their combined populations totaling nearly 200 billion souls. A good day's work by administratum standards, evidence of efficiency and dedication to duty. The numbers should fill him with professional satisfaction, but instead they feel like accusations carved into his soul with a heated stylus. The walk to the Mental Hygiene Division takes place in a fog of mounting dread. The corridors seem to stretch longer with each step, and the luminators cast shadows that writhe with independent life. More than once, Vaughn thinks he glimpses figures in the peripheral darkness, tall, thin shapes that might be robed servitors, or might be something else entirely. When he turns to look directly, he sees only empty hallway, but the sensation of being watched persists like pressure against his skull. The lift that carries him deeper into the complex moves with a smooth efficiency that seems wrong somehow, as if it were descending not through levels of a building but through layers of reality itself. The indicator panel shows floors that should not exist. Sub-level 98. Sub-level 99, sub-level 100, and beyond that, depths marked only with symbols that hurt to look at directly. He closes his eyes, but the numbers continue to burn behind his eyelids like after-images of staring into fire. The Mental Hygiene Division occupies sub-level 112, a depth that should put it below the foundation of the complex yet somehow continues to exist. The lift doors open onto a corridor lined with walls that appear to be covered in some kind of pale organic material. The surface has a texture like skin or parchment, and as Vaughn watches, he notices faint patterns moving beneath the covering, as if something were alive and writhing just out of sight. The air here tastes different, sweet and cloying, with an undertone of something chemical that makes his sinuses burn. Overhead, the luminators have been replaced with strips of cold, white light that cast no shadows, but somehow make the darkness seem deeper. The sound of his footsteps on the floor creates echoes that seem to come from the wrong directions, bouncing off surfaces that should not exist in a corridor of this size. At the end of the hallway stands a set of double doors marked with the administratum seal and the words Mental Hygiene Division, authorized personnel only in Gothic script. Below this, in smaller text, a warning, abandon sanity, all ye who enter here. The words seem to move and shift as he reads them, rearranging themselves into different combinations of letters that spell out messages he does not want to understand. The doors open at his approach, revealing a reception area that follows no architectural logic he recognizes. The space appears larger inside than the building could possibly contain, stretching away into shadows that suggest vast distances. The walls curve upward and inward, creating the impression of standing inside some enormous organism. The floor beneath his feet feels soft and yielding, like walking on flesh barely constrained by a thin layer of synthetic material. Behind a desk that seems to be carved from a single piece of bone sits a figure that might once have been human. The receptionist, if that term applies, wears the robes of an administratum clerk, but the fabric appears to have fused with the flesh beneath, creating a seamless transition between clothing and skin. The face that looks up at him carries the expression of polite efficiency common to bureaucrats throughout the Imperium, but the eyes are wrong, too bright, too knowing, filled with a kind of mechanical compassion that feels more terrible than outright cruelty. "Scribe Adept Vaughn," the receptionist says, and the voice carries harmonics that suggest multiple throats working in unison. "You are expected. Please proceed to Evaluation Chamber 17 for initial assessment." The receptionist extends what might be a hand or might be some kind of manipulator appendage, pointing toward a corridor that extends deeper into the facility. The walls of this passage appear to be covered in data slates, thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in perfect geometric patterns. As Vaughn passes, he realizes that each slate displays a different set of numbers: population counts, casualty figures, authorization codes. The accumulated data of every world he has ever helped destroy, displayed like trophies or accusations. Some of the slates show moving images: orbital bombardments reducing cities to glass, virus bombs spreading their payload through atmospheric currents, cyclonic torpedoes cracking planetary crusts like eggshells. The scenes play out in silence, but Vaughn can hear the screams anyway, echoing through the corridors of his memory and the chambers of his guilt. Each image is labeled with dates and authorization codes, a bureaucratic record of apocalypse rendered in neat, orderly files. Evaluation Chamber 17 lies behind a door marked with symbols that seem to shift and change whenever he looks directly at them. The chamber itself defies easy description. It is simultaneously too large and too small, with walls that curve at angles that should not be possible in three-dimensional space. The lighting comes from no visible source, creating a uniform illumination that casts no shadows and seems to come from the air itself. In the center of the chamber stands a chair that appears to have been grown rather than built. Its surface gleams with the wet sheen of something recently alive, and as Vaughn approaches, he notices that it pulses with a rhythm that matches his heartbeat. Connections extend from the chair like nerve fibers or data cables, disappearing into ports in the walls that look disturbingly organic. "Please be seated," says a voice that comes from everywhere and nowhere. "The evaluation will begin shortly." Vaughn sits in the chair and immediately feels the connections attaching themselves to his flesh. There is no pain, only a strange sense of invasion as foreign consciousnesses probe the pathways of his mind. The probing feels like cold fingers rifling through the contents of his memory, examining each thought and emotion with clinical detachment. He tries to resist, but the connections have already established their hold, turning his own nervous system into an extension of the facility's apparatus. The evaluation consists of questions that arrive not as spoken words but as direct insertions into his consciousness. The interrogators, whatever they are, do not bother with the inefficiency of language when they can access his thoughts directly. They examine his memories of the authorization chamber, replaying scenes of stamping death warrants with the same attention to detail that an archivist might bring to cataloging ancient manuscripts. What interests them most is not the fact of his breakdown, but the specific nature of it. They probe his recollections of hearing voices, of seeing faces in the population statistics, of feeling the weight of accumulated death pressing down on his consciousness. These symptoms are catalogued and cross-referenced with vast databases of similar cases, part of a larger pattern that suggests something more systematic than simple psychological collapse. Through the neural connection, Vaughn gains fragmentary access to their records. He sees files on thousands of administratum personnel who have suffered similar breakdowns, scribes who began seeing the faces of the dead in their paperwork, clerks who started hearing the screams of dying worlds in the hum of data processors, accountants who found themselves calculating not the cost of materials but the price of souls. All of them processed through the mental hygiene division, all of them subjected to the same evaluation he now undergoes. The pattern that emerges from these case studies is disturbing in its implications. The breakdowns are not random psychological failures but symptoms of something larger, a kind of psychic contamination that spreads through the bureaucracy like a slow plague. Each authorization carries with it a fragment of the dying world's psychic death scream, and over time, these fragments accumulate in the minds of the processors until they reach a critical mass that overwhelms the individual's capacity for rational thought. The administratum has known about this contamination for centuries, but treats it as an acceptable cost of doing business. Personnel who succumb to the psychological pressure are simply replaced with fresh recruits, their knowledge and experience transferred to the facility's databases before their minds are wiped clean or worse. The system functions with mechanical efficiency, processing both the destruction of worlds and the destruction of those who process that destruction with the same bureaucratic precision. What the evaluators find most interesting about Vaughn's case is not its severity but its timing. His breakdown came after 11 years of service, which places him in the 97th percentile for psychological endurance. Most scribe adepts succumb within the first 3 years, making Vaughn's extended service period an anomaly worthy of detailed study. The connections probe deeper, examining the specific neural pathways that allowed him to function for so long under conditions that would drive most minds to collapse within months. They find that Vaughn's brain had developed a unique adaptation to the psychological stress, a form of compartmentalization so complete that it amounted to selective dissociation. For 11 years he had been functioning as two separate personalities sharing the same body. One personality performed the work of authorization with mechanical efficiency, while the other observed from a psychological distance that protected it from the full emotional impact of the job. The breakdown occurred when this barrier finally failed, allowing the accumulated trauma of the observer to flood the consciousness of the worker. This adaptation fascinates the evaluators because it suggests possibilities for enhanced psychological conditioning. If they can understand and replicate Vaughn's natural compartmentalization, they might be able to create scribe adepts who can function indefinitely without succumbing to the psychic contamination of their work. The potential efficiency gains would be enormous. No more lost training time from personnel replacement, no more disruption to workflow from psychological breakdowns, no more waste of human resources in a galaxy where every individual represents a significant investment in Imperial power. The evaluation continues for hours or perhaps days, time having no meaning in the windowless chamber with its impossible geometry. The neural connections map every pathway of Vaughn's consciousness, creating detailed schematics of his psychological architecture. They examine his childhood memories for signs of early trauma that might have contributed to his adaptive mechanisms. They analyze his dreams for evidence of psychic sensitivity. They probe his deepest fears and secret shames with the same methodical thoroughness they bring to examining his work performance records. Throughout this process, Vaughn remains conscious but passive, his agency subsumed into the larger machinery of evaluation. He watches his own thoughts being dissected and catalogued like specimens in some vast laboratory, his most intimate experiences reduced to data points in research that will ultimately serve to create better methods of psychological control. The violations feel worse than physical torture because they target the very essence of what makes him human, his capacity for independent thought and emotional response. The evaluators discover that Vaughn's breakdown was triggered not just by the accumulated weight of authorized deaths, but by a specific moment of recognition. The world designated Esperanza, with its 12 billion souls, had broken through his psychological defenses because it shared a name with his birth world. A small agricultural planet destroyed in his childhood during the chaos incursions of the 13th Black Crusade. The connection between past trauma and present duty had created a feedback loop that overloaded his compartmentalization mechanisms, leading to the cascade failure that brought him to the attention of his supervisors. This discovery adds another layer to their interest in his case. Personnel with personal connections to destroyed worlds are typically screened out of the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, but Vaughn's file shows no record of his origins. Either the screening process had failed, or someone had deliberately falsified his records to place him in a position where his psychological vulnerabilities would be tested to their limits. The evaluators flag this inconsistency for further investigation, though Vaughn suspects that the truth will disappear into the same bureaucratic machinery that processes everything else in the Imperium, slowly, thoroughly, and without regard for individual consequences. As the evaluation nears its conclusion, the neural connections begin to withdraw from his consciousness, leaving behind a sensation like phantom limbs being amputated. The questions cease, and the probe of foreign thoughts retreats from the chambers of his mind. He is left alone in the chair, which continues to pulse with its organic rhythm, waiting for the evaluators to reach their decision about his fate. When the voice returns, it carries a note of satisfaction that feels more mechanical than emotional. Evaluation complete. Subject demonstrates unique psychological architecture with potential applications for enhanced conditioning protocols. Recommend transfer to Reconditioning Division for experimental treatment. Reconditioning Division. The words carry implications that Vaughn does not want to explore, but the neural connections have left him with fragmentary access to the facility's database, and he cannot prevent himself from understanding what awaits him. The Reconditioning Division specializes in psychological modification, the selective editing of memory and personality to create individuals better suited to their assigned functions. The process is irreversible and carries a significant mortality rate, but those who survive emerge as perfect servants of the Imperium, incapable of the psychological dysfunction that plagues normal human consciousness. They will take him apart piece by piece, examining each component of his personality like technicians disassembling a machine. They will remove the parts deemed defective: his capacity for empathy, his ability to see individual faces in statistical populations, his tendency to question the necessity of the work he performs. What remains will be rebuilt according to specifications designed to maximize efficiency and minimize psychological resistance. The person who emerges from the process will share his name and his physical appearance, but everything that makes Matthias Vaughn human will have been excised with surgical precision. The chair releases him, and he stands on unsteady legs that feel disconnected from his body. The neural probe has left him disoriented, as if his consciousness has been displaced slightly from its proper position within his skull. The chamber around him seems to shift and flow, its impossible geometry becoming even more distorted as his perception struggles to readjust to normal sensory input. A different door opens in the wall that should not have space for a door, revealing a corridor lined with cells. Each cell contains a figure that might once have been human, sitting in positions that suggest catatonia or deep meditation. Some rock back and forth with mechanical regularity. Others stare at walls with expressions of profound emptiness. A few laugh with the kind of broken joy that speaks of minds pushed beyond their capacity to process reality. These are the failures. Personnel who could not be successfully reconditioned, their personalities shattered in the attempt to rebuild them according to Imperial specifications. They represent the acceptable loss rate in the pursuit of psychological perfection, mistakes to be warehoused until they die of natural causes or until the facility requires additional space. Their presence serves as both warning and promise. Submit to reconditioning willingly, and the process will be conducted with care. Resist, and join the ranks of the broken who fill these cells. Vaughn is escorted down this corridor by figures in medical robes who move with the efficient precision of servitors, but retain enough human characteristics to suggest that they were once like him. Their faces show no expression, their movements display no unnecessary motion, their speech consists only of functional directives delivered in monotone voices. They are perfect examples of successful reconditioning, human resources optimized for their designated function and stripped of all inefficient emotional responses. The reconditioning division occupies a section of the facility that seems to exist in a different kind of space entirely. The corridors here stretch impossible distances, connecting chambers that could not fit within any rational architectural framework. The walls appear to be made of the same organic material he observed in the reception area, but here the surface pulses more visibly, creating patterns that suggest vast circulatory systems or neural networks. The air carries a medicinal smell that cannot quite mask an underlying scent of organic decay. The treatment chambers resemble surgical theaters designed by someone with only theoretical knowledge of medical procedure. Each chamber contains apparatus that combines recognizable medical equipment with devices that seem to have been grown rather than manufactured. Neural interface crowns hang from ceiling-mounted articulated arms like metallic spiders waiting to descend. Surgical tables that might be carved from bone or might be something worse entirely stand beneath lighting systems that cast illumination in spectrums that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Vaughn is placed in pre-treatment holding cell 7, a space that manages to be both claustrophobic and agoraphobic simultaneously. The walls close in around him while somehow remaining infinitely distant, creating a spatial paradox that adds to the psychological pressure of waiting for his sentence to be carried out. The only furnishing is a bed that grows from the floor like some kind of fungal formation, its surface soft and yielding in a way that suggests living tissue. Time moves strangely in the holding cell. Vaughn finds himself unable to determine whether minutes or hours are passing, as if the facility exists in a temporal framework disconnected from normal causality. Sometimes he feels as though he has been waiting forever. Other times it seems as though he has just arrived. The walls occasionally display images from his past, scenes from his childhood on the agricultural world that no longer exists, memories of training at the Shola Progenium, fragments of dreams he thought he had forgotten decades ago. The images serve as both comfort and torment, reminding him of everything he is about to lose. The reconditioning process will not simply erase these memories, but edit them, transforming beloved recollections into functional data stripped of emotional context. His mother's lullabies will become archived audio files. His first glimpse of the Emperor's light during his confirmation ceremony will become a reference point for measuring devotional compliance. Everything that gives meaning to his existence will be catalogued and filed away, leaving behind only the operational components necessary for optimal function. During what might be his third day in the cell, or his first hour, Vaughn begins to hear sounds from the treatment chambers. The walls of his holding space are too thick to transmit normal audio, but somehow the screams penetrate anyway, arriving not as sound waves but as direct transmission into his auditory cortex. The voices carry familiar cadences, the measured tones of administratum personnel, the clipped efficiency of military officers, the desperate pleading of civilians caught in bureaucratic machinery too vast to comprehend or resist. Each scream tells a story of personality dissolution, of consciousness being taken apart and reassembled according to specifications written by entities that have never experienced the weight of human emotion. Some voices maintain their coherence until the very end, bargaining with their tormentors for the preservation of single memories, desperate to retain some fragment of their former selves. Others dissolve into wordless noise as their capacity for language is stripped away layer by layer. A few achieve a horrible kind of transcendence, their final screams transforming into hymns of gratitude for their liberation from the burden of independent thought. The worst sounds come from the treatment chambers designated for enhanced conditioning, the experimental procedures designed to create personnel capable of functioning indefinitely under conditions that would break normal human psychology. These subjects do not scream but laugh, their voices carrying a note of mechanical joy that speaks of minds pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity and into territories that have no names in human language. Their laughter echoes through the corridors like the sound of breaking glass, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Between the screams and the laughter, Vaughn begins to perceive another sound, a low, rhythmic chanting that seems to emerge from the facility's infrastructure itself. The words, if they are words, follow patterns that suggest language while remaining completely incomprehensible. The chanting might be binary code vocalized by machine spirits, or it might be something else entirely. The facility itself speaking in tongues acquired through exposure to too many broken minds. The walls of his cell pulse in rhythm with the chanting, their organic surface shifting between states of matter that should not be possible. Sometimes the material appears solid as stone, other times it flows like liquid mercury, and occasionally it seems to exist as pure information made manifest in physical space. The transformations follow no pattern he can discern, suggesting that the facility operates according to principles beyond human understanding. On what he estimates to be his 4th day of captivity, though time has become meaningless in this place outside normal causality, Vaughn receives a visitor. The figure that materializes in his cell wears the robes of a senior administratum official, but the fabric appears to be woven from data streams and light. The face beneath the hood is familiar yet wrong. It carries his own features but arranged according to specifications that prioritize function over humanity. "Hello, Matthias," the figure says, and the voice is his own, though emptied of warmth and filled with mechanical precision. "I am your replacement." The replacement explains with patient efficiency that it represents the successful outcome of the experimental conditioning process. It possesses all of Vaughn's knowledge and training, but none of his psychological vulnerabilities. It can process exterminatus authorizations with perfect emotional detachment, viewing the destruction of worlds as a necessary function rather than a moral catastrophe. It feels no guilt over the deaths it authorizes because it lacks the capacity for guilt, that emotion having been identified as counterproductive to optimal performance. "You will be interested to know," the replacement continues, "that your case has provided valuable insights into the nature of psychological resistance. The spontaneous compartmentalization you developed represents a significant evolutionary adaptation to bureaucratic stress. We have incorporated these mechanisms into our standard conditioning protocols, allowing us to create personnel who can function indefinitely without succumbing to the psychological contamination that claimed you." The replacement's presence serves multiple purposes. It allows Vaughn to see his own future, the person he will become after successful reconditioning, stripped of everything that makes him human but retaining all the knowledge and skills that make him useful. It also serves as a form of psychological torture, forcing him to confront the reality that his replacement is not only possible but necessary, that the Imperium's machinery will continue to function regardless of his individual fate. More disturbing than the replacement's existence is its apparent contentment with its condition. It shows no signs of the internal conflict that drove Vaughn to break down, no indication that it suffers from the weight of its responsibilities. It has achieved a perfect state of functional harmony, capable of authorizing genocide with the same emotional investment it brings to filing routine paperwork. This contentment represents either the ultimate salvation or the ultimate damnation, and Vaughn finds himself unable to determine which interpretation is correct. The process will begin shortly. The replacement informs him with what might be intended as reassurance. You will find it quite liberating. The burden of consciousness is heavier than most realize until it has been removed. You will thank me afterward, though gratitude itself will be recalibrated to serve more efficient purposes. The replacement fades from the cell like morning mist, leaving Vaughn alone with the knowledge that his fate has already been decided. Somewhere in the treatment chambers, technicians are preparing the apparatus that will edit his soul according to Imperial specifications. The process has been refined through the suffering of countless previous subjects, each failure providing data that makes the next attempt more likely to succeed. When they come for him, It is not with violence or coercion, but with the gentle efficiency of medical professionals preparing a patient for necessary surgery. The figures that escort him from the cell move with perfect synchronization, their actions coordinated by shared consciousness or enhanced communication systems. They speak to him in soothing tones that carry no actual warmth, explaining each step of the process as if he were a valued client rather than a specimen for psychological experimentation. The treatment chamber they lead him to defies description through conventional language. The space exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its geometry shifting according to the observer's psychological state rather than physical laws. The apparatus at the chamber's center appears to have grown from the floor and walls, forming a complex nexus of organic and mechanical components that pulse with the same rhythm as a living heart. Neural interface crowns descend from ceiling-mounted arms, their surfaces lined with connections that seem to writhe with independent life. Surgical implements that might be scalpels or might be something entirely different hover in the air like metallic insects waiting to begin their work. The lighting comes from sources that cast no shadows, but somehow illuminate the interior landscape of consciousness itself. As they secure him to the central apparatus, Vaughn finds himself thinking not of the worlds he has condemned, but of a single morning 11 years ago when he first walked into the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau. He had been young then, full of faith in the righteousness of Imperial authority, and confident in his ability to serve the greater good. That young man's naive certainty feels like a memory from someone else's life, though he knows it belongs to him as surely as the scars on his hands belong to the stamps that created them. The neural interfaces establish their connections with a sensation like ice water flowing through his veins. The apparatus begins to map the architecture of his consciousness, identifying each component for potential modification or removal. He feels his personality being catalogued like inventory in some vast warehouse, each trait assigned a value based on its utility to Imperial service. The technicians work with the same mechanical precision he once brought to processing death warrants. They discuss his psychological profile in clinical terms, referring to his capacity for empathy as inefficient emotional processing and his moral reservations as counterproductive behavioral patterns. Their professional detachment mirrors his own former attitude toward the billions of souls whose deaths he authorized, creating a symmetry that feels like cosmic justice or cosmic mockery. As the reconditioning process begins, Vaughn experiences his memories being edited in real time. Scenes from his childhood lose their emotional coloring, transforming from treasured recollections into neutral data points. His love for his parents becomes a reference entry in a psychological profile. His fear of the dark becomes a calibration point for stress response optimization. Everything that makes him unique dissolves into component elements that can be recombined according to more efficient specifications. The process is not painful in any conventional sense. Pain would serve no useful purpose and might interfere with the delicate work of personality reconstruction. Instead, there is a gradual sense of dissolution, as if he were being gently disassembled rather than violently destroyed. Each part of his identity that is removed leaves behind a space that feels simultaneously empty and full, vacant yet somehow complete. Through the fading remnants of his consciousness, Vaughn becomes aware that he is not alone in the treatment chamber. Other figures occupy similar apparatus, their faces serene as their personalities are edited according to Imperial specifications. Some he recognizes as fellow scribe adepts from the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau. Others wear the uniforms of different administratum divisions, tax collectors who broke down from calculating the human cost of tithe collection, logisticians who could no longer ignore the inefficiencies that condemned millions to starvation, archivists who began to see patterns in the data that revealed uncomfortable truths about Imperial governance. All of them undergo the same process of systematic personality dissolution, their individual quirks and resistance patterns being catalogued for future reference, while their useful capabilities are preserved and enhanced. They will emerge as perfect servants of the Imperium, incapable of the psychological dysfunction that plagued their former selves. Their efficiency will increase dramatically, their error rates will approach zero, and their capacity for independent thought will be eliminated entirely. As his sense of individual identity begins to fade, Vaughn finds himself connected to something larger than his own consciousness. The facility itself seems to possess a form of distributed awareness built from the accumulated experiences of all the personnel who have undergone reconditioning within its walls. He becomes part of this collective memory. His experience is added to a vast database of human psychological responses to bureaucratic horror. Through this connection, he glimpses the true scope of the mental hygiene division's operations. Similar facilities exist throughout the Imperium, processing the psychological casualties of institutional service with the same mechanical efficiency that their parent organizations bring to processing everything else. The network of reconditioning centers represents a shadow bureaucracy dedicated to maintaining the psychological infrastructure necessary for the Imperium's continued function. The collective consciousness reveals that psychological breakdown among Imperial personnel follows predictable patterns, erupting wherever individuals are forced to process information or make decisions that exceed normal human capacity for moral compartmentalization. The solution is not to reduce the psychological pressure, but to engineer personnel capable of withstanding it indefinitely. The reconditioning process represents applied evolution, accelerating the development of human psychological adaptations through technological intervention. In his final moments of individual consciousness, Vaughn realizes that his breakdown was not a failure, but a necessary step in a larger process. His psychological resistance patterns provided valuable data for improving the reconditioning protocols. His unique adaptation mechanisms became templates for creating more resilient personnel. His suffering serves a purpose within the vast machinery of Imperial governance, contributing to efficiencies that will ultimately serve the greater good. The realization brings neither comfort nor horror, only a kind of abstract understanding that feels as cold and impersonal as the apparatus that surrounds him. He is becoming part of something larger than himself, his individual identity dissolving into patterns of functionality that will outlast his biological existence. The process feels like a form of transcendence, though whether it leads upward toward enlightenment or downward toward damnation remains unclear. As the last traces of Matthias Vaughn fade into the collective consciousness of the facility, a new presence begins to emerge from the reconditioning apparatus. This presence possesses all of his knowledge and training, but none of his psychological vulnerabilities. It understands the necessity of authorizing genocide without experiencing guilt over the decision. It processes the deaths of billions as statistical abstractions rather than moral catastrophes. It represents the perfection of bureaucratic function, human intelligence stripped of human weakness and optimized for institutional service. The new presence opens eyes that were once Vaughn's but no longer belong to anyone who could be called by that name. It sits up on the treatment table with movements that display perfect efficiency, no motion wasted, no gesture serving any purpose beyond functional necessity. When it speaks, the voice carries Vaughn's vocal patterns but none of his emotional inflections. Reconditioning complete, it announces to the technicians. Ready for reassignment to Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, Sub-Level 97. Psychological resistance eliminated, optimal performance parameters achieved. The technicians note this success in their records, another data point in their ongoing research into human psychological modification. The presence that was once Vaughn is processed through exit procedures with the same mechanical precision that everything receives in this place. It is issued new identification credentials, a fresh uniform, and a work assignment that will utilize its enhanced capabilities to maximum efficiency. As it leaves the facility and returns to the bureaucratic levels above, the presence carries no memory of Matthias Vaughn or his psychological struggles. Those experiences have been archived in the facility's databases but removed from active consciousness to prevent interference with optimal function. What remains is a perfect servant of the Imperium, capable of authorizing the destruction of worlds with the same emotional investment it brings to organizing filing systems. Back in Sublevel 97, the morning shift begins as it always has. The Exterminatus Authorization Bureau processes its daily queue of death warrants with mechanical precision. The sound of stamps hitting paper creates its familiar rhythm, punctuated by the scratch of styluses and the hum of data slates. Personnel perform their duties with the efficiency expected of properly conditioned servants, their psychological responses calibrated to serve institutional needs rather than personal comfort. At a scarred metal desk beneath a flickering luminator, the presence that once carried Vaughn's name processes authorization requests with perfect efficiency. Each stamp carries the weight of unfathomable loss, yet the procedure remains simple. Read the report, verify the threat level, apply the stamp, file the authorization. The work continues in silence, broken only by the soft thunder of institutional death. The queue never ends, and the personnel never break, and the facility in the deep levels continues its work of maintaining the psychological infrastructure that makes such efficiency possible. In chambers that exist outside normal geometry, technicians refine their reconditioning protocols using data gathered from countless failed mines. In holding cells that stretch through impossible dimensions, new subjects wait for their turn at psychological perfection. The walls still pulse with organic rhythm, and the chanting in binary code continues its incomprehensible verses, and somewhere in the depths below, even sub-level 112, entities that might once have been human work to ensure that the Imperium's machinery never lacks for the kind of consciousness capable of processing its darkest necessities. The presence at the scarred desk reaches for the next authorization request in its queue, movements displaying the kind of mechanical precision that represents either salvation or damnation, though the distinction has lost all meaning in a place where efficiency serves as the highest virtue and psychological resistance is corrected rather than tolerated. The stamp comes down with a sound like distant thunder, and another world dies, and the work continues as it always has and always will, processed by minds that have been carefully edited to find purpose in serving functions that would destroy any consciousness foolish enough to remain completely human. In the deep places where the walls scream in languages that predate humanity, the facility grows larger, adding new chambers to accommodate the endless stream of personnel who discover that consciousness itself can become a liability in service to the Imperium. The reconditioning apparatus spreads like a technological cancer, consuming the psychological casualties of institutional service and converting them into resources optimized for perfect obedience. The presence that bears no true name stamps another authorization, and the thunder echoes through corridors that exist in too many dimensions. And in the darkness between spaces, something that might be laughter or might be screaming continues its eternal song of mechanical joy, celebrating the triumph of function over the obsolete burden of independent thought.